It was the kind of cold that crept under your skin and stayed there, even though the calendar swore it was only late September. The leaves in the Adirondacks had begun their fiery transformation, a symphony of crimson, gold, and orange, but beneath their beauty lurked a stillness that felt wrong to anyone who spent enough time in these woods. Mark Ellison knew these mountains better than most. At 45, he'd hunted, fished, and hiked this terrain for decades, and he could read the forest the way some men read newspapers. Which is why, when his chocolate lab, Scout, stopped dead on the trail that Saturday morning, hackles raised, Mark froze mid-step. "Easy, boy," he whispered, but Scout's body was rigid, his nose working furiously in the crisp air. They were deep in the western Adirondacks, miles from the nearest road, in an area Mark knew wasn't popular with hunters because of its rough, uneven ground and lack of game. He came here for the solitude more than the deer. Today was supposed to be like any other, a quiet morning hike before heading home to his wife and teenage daughter. But then Scout bolted. "Scout." Mark's voice cracked through the forest, sharp and loud. The dog rarely disobeyed him, but this was different. Scout tore off the trail, bounding through the undergrowth, ignoring branches that whipped at his sides. Cursing, Mark followed. It took nearly 5 minutes of chasing before he found the dog, whining and pawing frantically at a shallow depression between two moss-covered boulders. At first, Mark thought Scout had caught the scent of an animal, maybe a buried carcass or a fox den, but then he saw it. The corner of a small, blue fabric bundle, so caked with dirt and forest debris it barely stood out against the ground. "Scout, what the hell did you find?" Mark muttered, heart thudding as he crouched. He brushed away the dirt, and the bundle came loose with a sickening softness, like wet paper tearing. Inside, something pale and stiff caught the sunlight. A tiny shoe. Mark stumbled back so fast he nearly tripped over a root. His mind raced, refusing to believe what his eyes were telling him. The shoe was no bigger than his hand, faded pink with a small embroidered flower on the side. Attached to it was the fragile curve of what was unmistakably a human foot, bones wrapped in tatters of decaying fabric. Scout whined louder, circling the hole, tail tucked. Mark's stomach lurched violently. He backed away and fumbled for his phone, praying for a signal this deep in the woods. Miraculously, one bar flickered. He dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "This is Mark Ellison," he said as soon as the dispatcher answered, his voice rough. "I'm in the western Adirondacks, off the Old Creek Trail. My dog, we found human remains. A child, I think." There was a pause, and then the dispatcher's tone sharpened. "Stay where you are, sir. Can you give me GPS coordinates?" Mark did, reading the numbers off his hunting app. "Hi."
State police arrived nearly 2 hours later, their approach heralded by the sound of a helicopter thudding somewhere above the tree line. Mark had stayed exactly where he was, as instructed, fighting the urge to pace. When the first trooper emerged from the woods, a tall woman in a wide-brimmed hat, her uniform immaculate despite the rugged terrain, Mark felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. "Mr. Ellison?" she asked. He nodded mutely. "I'm Trooper Karen Lacey," she said, glancing at the disturbed ground where Scout had found the bundle. "We're going to take it from here. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Mark recounted everything, the morning hike, Scout's behavior, the discovery. His voice shook only once when he mentioned the small pink shoe. Lacey listened intently, jotting notes in a waterproof notebook. "Did you touch anything besides what you used to call 911? "Just enough to see what it was," Mark admitted. "I didn't move anything else." She gave a curt nod. "You did the right thing." By then, more troopers had arrived, along with a pair of men in civilian clothes, crime scene techs, judging by their cases of equipment. They cordoned off the area, setting up bright yellow tape that looked jarringly out of place against the autumn forest. Mark was escorted a short distance away to give a formal statement. He sat on a folding camp chair someone provided, Scout leashed at his feet, while Lacey asked more detailed questions. She kept circling back to one point. Why was he here in this particular area when most hunters avoided it? I like the solitude, Mark said simply. Did you notice anything unusual on the trail before this? Any signs of a campsite, old fire rings, gear left behind? Nothing, Mark replied. This place has always been empty. Lacey's pen paused mid-scribble. Not always, she murmured. It was past noon when they finally released him. As he hiked back toward his truck, accompanied by another trooper, Mark couldn't shake the image of that tiny shoe, nor could he ignore the growing sense that he had just stepped into something far larger than he understood. News of the discovery broke that evening. Mark was at home, sitting at the kitchen table with his wife, Rachel, when the local channel aired the story. Authorities have yet to release a formal identification, the anchor intoned, but sources close to the investigation say the remains may be linked to the 2023 disappearance of 28-year-old Hannah Myers and her 5-year-old son Luke. The pair vanished during a weekend camping trip in the Adirondack Park. Despite a massive search effort involving hundreds of volunteers, no trace of them was ever found, until now. Rachel turned to him, eyes wide. Mark, is that what you found? He nodded grimly. Part of it, anyway. She reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You did the right thing, did I? He wondered silently, because now, as reporters camped outside their driveway,
they called off the search at sundown, but Mark barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that scrap of green fabric swaying in the breeze, 10 feet off the ground like some kind of warning. By morning, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. News vans clogged the narrow road leading to the trailheads, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Talk shows speculated wildly about Hannah and Luke Myers' fate. Was it a serial predator? A deranged drifter? Or had Hannah somehow harmed her own child and vanished into the forest? Mark hated all of it. He didn't know these people, but somehow, after finding Luke's remains, he felt responsible for their story. Trooper Lacey called again that afternoon. We're moving deeper, she said. We found another item this morning, about a mile east of yesterday's location. A child's backpack, partially buried. It contained Luke's dental records, confirming identity beyond doubt. We need you and Scout again. Mark agreed, even as a knot tightened in his stomach. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was leading them breadcrumb by breadcrumb. This time, the search team was larger: state police, forensic anthropologists, and 2 other dog handlers. They moved in a tight grid formation, methodical and slow. Scout ranged ahead, nose to the ground, tail low and purposeful. Hours passed with nothing but damp leaves and mosquitoes for company. Then, just as Mark was about to call for a break, Scout stopped dead. His body stiffened, his gaze locked on a cluster of low cedars up ahead. Mark's heart kicked into overdrive. What is it, boy? Scout growled softly, a low, rumbling sound Mark had heard only a handful of times in his life. Lacey and another trooper approached cautiously. Together, they pushed aside the cedars. The smell hit first. Sweet and rotten, the unmistakable stench of human decomposition. Even though nearly 2 years had passed, the forest had preserved what lay beneath in a ghastly way. Jesus, one of the troopers muttered, turning away. Lacey crouched, shining her flashlight over the shallow grave. What remained of a woman's body lay curled on its side, partially mummified by the acidic soil. The skull was fractured, and a length of rope still bound the wrists. It's her, Lacey said grimly. Hannah Myers. For a long moment, no one spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Lacey stood, her jaw tight. We've got enough for homicide. Whoever did this left her here like garbage. She turned to Mark. Thank you. Without you and Scout, this would have stayed hidden forever. Mark nodded numbly, but inside, a storm raged. Because as horrific as this discovery was, something about it didn't sit right. The body wasn't hidden well. The items they'd found, the shoe, the jacket, the backpack, they weren't scattered by accident. Someone wanted them found. That night, Mark sat in his garage, staring at Scout as the dog slept in his bed. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched in those woods, a prickling on the back of his neck that never quite went away. He pulled out his old topo maps, spreading them across the workbench. He marked where each item had been found: Luke's remains, Hannah's jacket, the backpack, and now Hannah's body. When he connected the points with a pencil, his blood ran cold. They formed a near-perfect line. Not random at all. The next morning, Mark drove to the barracks uninvited. He slapped his map down on Lacey's desk. "Look at this," he said. She studied it, brow furrowing. "You think this was intentional?" "I know it," Mark replied. "And if you keep following this line," he traced it northeast across the map, over ridges and streams, until it ended at a blank patch of forest miles from any road. "Whatever's out there, this is where we'll find it." Lacey stared at the map for a long moment, then picked up the phone. Within an hour, they had a helicopter, a team of 20, and a warrant to search the coordinates Mark had identified. The flight was short but tense. From the air, the forest stretched endlessly, a sea of red and gold broken only by jagged outcroppings of rock. When they touched down in a small clearing, the team fanned out immediately. Mark and Scout led the way. It didn't take long. Half a mile from the landing zone, Scout began barking frantically at a mound of rocks piled deliberately against a cliff face. Lacey called for the team to halt, then signaled the techs forward. They removed the rocks one by one until a dark opening yawned before them, a cave, its entrance disguised for who knew how long. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The beam of Lacey's flashlight swept across the walls, illuminating something that made Mark's stomach lurch. Names. Dozens of them, scratched into the stone. Some with dates. Some with crude drawings of stick figures. And near the back, in fresher, darker lettering.
The cave was silent except for the dripping of water somewhere deep within. Every member of the search team stood frozen, their flashlights casting jittery cones of light across the names etched into the stone. Mark stepped closer despite himself, eyes scanning the walls. The names weren't random. They were arranged in rough clusters, as though grouped by year. The earliest he could make out was 1986. The most recent, besides Hannah and Luke's, was 2021. "Dear God," one of the forensic techs whispered. "How many are we talking about?" "Too many," Lacey said, her voice tight. She turned to her team. "Get photos of everything. Catalog it all. We're treating this as a major crime scene." Mark felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Lacey. "You need to leave this part to us now," she said gently. "This is going to take days, maybe weeks, but you've done more than enough." He wanted to argue, but the weight of what they'd found pressed down on him like a physical force. He gave a stiff nod and allowed himself to be escorted back to the clearing for pickup. That night, sleep was impossible. Mark sat on his porch with a tumbler of whiskey, staring out into the darkness beyond his yard. Scout lay at his feet, ears twitching occasionally at unseen sounds. His mind kept returning to those names. Why were they there? Were they victims? Why had no one noticed this pattern of disappearances spanning decades? By dawn, he'd made a decision. He wasn't done with this, not by a long shot. The next few days were a whirlwind of media coverage. News outlets from across the country descended on the Adirondacks, dubbing the discovery the Adirondack Grave Cave. Details leaked. Multiple sets of remains found within, some decades old. Evidence suggesting ritualistic behavior. Theories ranging from serial killers to cults. Mark avoided interviews, but that didn't stop reporters from hounding him. He turned them all away, though one question gnawed at him relentlessly. If the cave was active until at least 2023, was whoever did this still out there? On the fourth day, Lacey called again. "Ellison," she said without preamble, "we've got something you need to see. Can you come to the barracks?" When he arrived, she led him to a small conference room. On the table were photographs, dozens of them, taken inside the cave. "This," she said, pointing to one, was carved directly beneath Hannah and Luke's names. Mark leaned closer. It was a crude depiction of a man's face, oval-shaped with deep-set eyes, a prominent nose, and a jagged line across the forehead. Beneath it, in block letters, was a single word. Hunter. Mark frowned. You think that's a self-portrait? Possibly, Lacey replied. But here's where it gets interesting. She slid another photo across the table. It was a close-up of an old, yellowed newspaper clipping found inside the cave. It was from 1994. The headline read, "Local Team Missing After Solo Hunting Trip." The accompanying photo showed a 17-year-old boy, rifle slung over his shoulder. Even through the grainy print, Mark could see the resemblance to the carving. The same deep-set eyes, the same nose. Name was Gregory Holt, Lacey said. Never found. His parents claimed he knew these woods better than anyone. Some people believed he ran away. Others thought he got lost. But what if? She let the sentence hang. Mark finished it for her. What if he never left? What if he became this? Lacey nodded grimly. We're pulling every missing persons case from the last 40 years tied to this region. There's a pattern. I can feel it. But we're missing the connective tissue. And I think you, Ellison, you might be able to find it. Mark blinked. Me? Why? Because you got instincts. And because Scout found what none of our people could. Later that night, Mark spread the old topo maps on his workbench again. This time, he overlaid them with copies of missing persons reports Lacey had given him. As he marked each disappearance, a disturbing image emerged. All of them, every single one, formed a rough perimeter around a central area of wilderness. An area with no official trails. No recorded campsites. An area locals called Black Hollow. Mark had heard of it, of course. Every Adirondack hunter had. It was the kind of place whispered about around campfires, a void on the map where compasses supposedly went haywire and strange lights flickered at night. He traced the perimeter with a shaking hand. Whatever was happening here hadn't stopped. It was waiting. The following morning, Mark called Lacey. I'm going to Black Hollow, he said, with or without you. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, she said, then I guess I'm coming too. They set out at dawn, just the two of them and Scout. Lacey insisted on keeping the operation off the books for now. Too many eyes on the investigation, too much red tape. If they found something worth escalating, then they'd call in. The forest swallowed them whole within minutes. There were no trails leading into Black Hollow, only dense undergrowth and towering pines that blotted out the rising sun. The air grew cooler, damper, and oppressively still. Feels wrong, doesn't it? Mark muttered. Lacey scanned the trees, hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. Like walking into someone's house uninvited. Scout ranged ahead, nose low, tail wagging slowly, a sure sign he was tracking something. After 2 hours of hard hiking, they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a valley choked with fog. In the center stood a clearing, perfectly circular, as though carved out of the forest by something unnatural. Mark's gut tightened. That's it. That's Black Hollow. They descended cautiously, weapons ready. The moment they stepped into the clearing, Scout froze. His body went rigid, ears flat against his skull. Then he whimpered and backed behind Mark's legs, something he'd never done before. What is it, boy? Mark whispered. Scout only whined louder. Lacey knelt, running her hand through the tall grass. Something's off here, she said. Then she pulled her hand back sharply. It was slick with something dark. Blood. Fresh. Mark's stomach turned as he scanned the clearing. At first glance, it seemed empty, but then he saw them. Bones. Dozens of them, half buried in the soil, poking up like pale roots. Skulls, femurs, ribs, some human, some animal. All scattered in a pattern that made no sense until Lacey noticed it too. They're arranged, she said softly, in a spiral. The center of the spiral was a wooden post driven deep into the earth. Tied to it with frayed rope was a strip of green fabric, the same shade as Hannah Meyer's jacket. Mark felt bile rise in his throat. We need to get out of here. Now. But as they turned to leave, a branch snapped in the trees beyond the clearing. Lacey drew her gun. Who's there? State police. Silence. Then another sound, a low, guttural laugh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Scout barked furiously, lunging at the tree line. Mark raised his rifle, scanning the shadows. "Show yourself." The laughter stopped, and then, from the fog at the far edge of the clearing, a figure stepped forward. Tall, lean, wearing a tattered camouflage jacket and a mask made of animal hide stitched crudely together. In one hand, he held a rusted hunting knife. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them, and then spoke in a voice roughened by years of disuse. "You shouldn't have come here." Before either of them could react, he melted back into the trees, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. They didn't run. They couldn't afford to make noise. But their retreat from Black Hollow was swift and tense. Every snapped twig behind them made Mark's skin crawl. Scout kept growling, eyes locked on the shadows. When they finally emerged from the dense forest hours later, Lacey radioed for immediate backup. Within an hour, a full tactical team had surrounded the perimeter of Black Hollow. But when they swept the clearing, it was empty. The post, the bones, even the blood, gone as if it had never been there. "Impossible," one of the officers muttered. Mark stared at the now pristine clearing, mind reeling. He'd seen those bones. He'd heard that laugh. And he knew, deep in his gut, that the figure they'd encountered wasn't done with them. Lacey approached, face pale, but determined. "This isn't over," she said. "Whoever that was, he's been here for decades. He knows every inch of these woods. We're hunting a ghost." Mark shook his head. "No, we're hunting a man, and men can bleed." That night, back home, Mark found something on his porch. A single, small pink shoe. The other one. Rachel screamed when she saw the shoe. Mark had to snatch it up quickly, shoving it into a plastic bag before their daughter came downstairs and saw it too. His heart hammered as he locked the door and called Lacey. She arrived within the hour, unmarked SUV pulling silently into his driveway. When Mark handed her the bag, she studied the shoe without touching it. "This wasn't here when you got home?" "No," Mark said. "I was gone maybe 20 minutes. Ran to the store. Came back, and there it was. Whoever we saw in Black Hollow, he followed me home." Lacey's jaw tightened. "Then we're dealing with someone bold, confident, and maybe trying to send you a message. Or a threat," Mark replied darkly. Scout barked suddenly from the living room, facing the window. His hackles were raised. Lacey crossed quickly, peering out through the curtains, but saw nothing. "We're putting you and your family in protective custody tonight," she said firmly. No arguments. They relocated to a small cabin owned by the state police, a remote, nondescript place deep enough in the woods to be secure, but close enough to resources if things went wrong. Lacey stayed with them, her sidearm always within reach. That night, as the others slept, Mark sat at the kitchen table with a map spread before him. He couldn't stop thinking about the clearing, the spiral of bones, and that mass figure. Something about it nagged at him, like a puzzle piece refusing to fit. Then it hit him. The spiral. It hadn't been random. It matched the topography of Black Hollow itself. Concentric ridges of land circling a central depression. And if the wooden post had been at the very center? He grabbed a pencil, marking the center on the map, then cross-referenced it with an old survey file he'd once downloaded out of curiosity. His stomach dropped. There was an abandoned hunting lodge built there in the 1950s, later condemned after several unexplained accidents. Officially, it had been demolished. Unofficially, Mark doubted that. At dawn, he showed Lacey his findings. "An old lodge?" she asked, skeptical but intrigued. "Not just a lodge," Mark said. "A place people used to go when they wanted to disappear for a while. If he's been operating here for decades, that's where he's living." Lacey stared at the map, then nodded. "We're going in. But this time, we bring everything we've got." By mid-afternoon, a full task force had mobilized. Dozens of officers, forensic techs, and K-9 units assembled at the edge of Black Hollow. Mark insisted on going with them. Lacey didn't argue. The hiking was tense, but uneventful, until Scout suddenly stopped dead, ears pricked, nose to the ground. He led them unerringly toward the central depression. What they found there was worse than anything Mark had imagined. The lodge still stood, though half collapsed and choked with vines. Inside, the stench was overpowering. A mix of mildew, rot, and something far fouler. The walls were lined with trophies, not animal heads, but personal belongings. Watches, wallets, necklaces, toys, each meticulously labeled with a name and date. Near the fireplace hung a map of the Adirondacks, peppered with red pins. Every pin marked a disappearance. And in the center of the room, on a crude wooden table, lay something that made Lacey's blood run cold. A journal. They flipped through it carefully, photographing every page. The entries began in 1987 and continued almost yearly thereafter. They detailed hunts, not for deer, but for people. Short, chilling notes like, August 94, took the boy near Eagle Creek. Good runner. Lasted 2 days. September 03, woman fought hard. Buried her on the ridge. June 21, couple from Vermont. Never even saw me coming. The final entry was dated October 2023. The woman and the child. Camped near Old Creek Trail. She cried for him. Took her first. He wouldn't stop screaming. Left him where they'll find him. Soon, they'll all know I'm still here. Lacey slammed the journal shut. This is it. We've got him. But Mark's eyes were fixed on the very last line, scrawled hastily in the margin. Watching you, Ellison. You made this fun again. Before they could react, a shot rang out. Glass shattered as a bullet tore through the window, missing Lacey by inches. Sniper. Down, someone yelled. Chaos erupted. Officers returned fire toward the tree line as Mark dragged Scout to cover. Through the shattered window, he caught a glimpse of movement. A figure darting between trees, animal hide mask flashing briefly before vanishing into the forest. He was still out there, and now it was personal. The forest erupted into controlled chaos as the task force fanned out, sweeping the area for the shooter. Orders barked over radios, boots pounding against the forest floor, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. But after 30 minutes, they had nothing. The sniper had vanished like smoke. Inside the lodge, Lacey slammed her fist against the rotting table. He's toying with us. He's been doing this for decades, and he knows every escape route in these woods. Mark crouched by Scout, who still trembled despite his usual steadiness. He's not just toying with us, Mark said quietly. He's studying us. He's been here, watching, probably since the second we stepped into Black Hollow. Lacey turned to him. Then we turn the tables. We stop playing defense. Ow! We make him come to us. That night, they regrouped at the barracks. The journal lay open on the table in front of them, surrounded by maps and evidence photos. Each entry was a wound in the history of these mountains, each name a ghost crying for justice. Lacey pointed to the most recent pages. He craves recognition. Look at the way he wrote about Hannah and Luke. Soon, they'll all know I'm still here. He left evidence deliberately. He wanted to be found. Now he's fixated on you, Ellison. Mark felt a chill at the memory of that final line. Watching you, Ellison. So what? We bait him. Lacey nodded. We'll release limited information to the media. Make it look like you're leading the search, that you've uncovered details only he would understand. It'll force his hand. He'll either come for you directly, or he'll leave us something to chase. And in the meantime, Lacey said grimly, we prepare for war in these woods. Over the next 48 hours, they set their plan in motion. Carefully planted news stories credited Mark as the civilian tracker who had broken the case wide open. Photos of him with Scout ran on local and national outlets. Then they waited. The response came quicker than anyone expected. On the third night, Mark's phone buzzed with an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. A low, rasping voice filled his ear. You think you understand my woods, it said. You don't. You're just another animal in my snare. Mark's blood ran cold. Who are you? The caller chuckled, a sound that sent every hair on his body standing on end. You'll know soon enough. I left you a gift. For the dog. The line went dead. They traced the call to a cell tower near Black Hollow. At dawn, a team swept the area. Near the entrance to the forest, they found it. A severed deer head mounted on a stake, a crude collar around its neck with the word Scout carved into the leather. Mark's stomach turned as Scout whined, pressing against his leg. "He's escalating," Lacey said, face like stone. "He's daring us to come after him." "Then let's take the dare," Mark growled. They moved back into Black Hollow with a larger force, this time setting up a semi-permanent command post on the outskirts. Cameras, motion sensors, and traps were deployed throughout the valley. Every entry point was monitored, and still, he outmaneuvered them. Every morning, they found evidence of his presence. A footprint just outside a camera's range, a freshly gutted animal left near camp. Once even a set of boot prints leading right up to Mark's tent before vanishing into the night. "He's inside the perimeter," one officer muttered. "No," Mark corrected, staring into the darkness beyond their floodlights. "We're inside his." On the sixth night, the trap finally snapped. A motion sensor triggered deep in the valley, followed by a burst of static over their radios. The tech monitoring the camera shouted, "We've got movement." Lacey grabbed her rifle. "Move." They plunged into the forest, guided by the signal. The air was thick with fog, muffling sound and distorting shapes. Scout pulled hard on the lead, nose to the ground. Then they saw it, a dim light ahead, flickering through the trees. They approached cautiously, weapons raised. The light emanated from a lantern hanging in front of a small, makeshift shelter built from branches and hides. Inside, a single figure sat cross-legged, head bowed, animal hide mask gleaming in the lantern's glow. "State Police," Lacey shouted, "hands where I can see them." The figure didn't move. Mark edged closer, heart hammering. "Take the mask off. Now." Still no response. Lacey stepped forward and kicked the figure over, only to find it was a crude mannequin dressed in old clothes, the mask nailed to a log. Beneath it lay a note, written in charcoal on animal skin. "Good chase. My turn now." At that exact moment, a scream erupted back at the command post. The first snow of the season fell quietly over the Adirondacks, softening the edges of the forest but doing little to erase the unease that had settled in. The search had narrowed to a swath of remote woodland near Little Moose Lake, an area so treacherous that even seasoned hunters avoided it in winter. Detective Mara Hensley stood at the edge of a clearing, breath misting in the frigid air as she studied the ground where Bo, the hunter's bloodhound, had stopped again. The dog whined, circling the area before pawing at the earth beneath the snow. "Same spot," said Tom Wilkins, the hunter who owned Bo. His face was pale beneath his beard. "He's been fixated here for days." Mara knelt, brushing snow aside to reveal a strange pattern in the dirt. At first glance, it looked like natural rock, but as the snow melted beneath her gloves, she saw grooves, straight lines too precise to be natural. A door, wooden, hidden beneath soil and stone. Her pulse quickened. "Get the others." Now, minutes later, a small team of state troopers arrived with shovels and crowbars. It took nearly an hour to expose the full outline of the door. The entrance was sealed tight, reinforced with rusted iron. Mara's chest tightened as they pried it open, and the stench of rot and damp earth wafted up from the darkness below. Bo growled, low and guttural. Flashlights pierced the blackness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into what appeared to be a cellar carved directly into the rock. They moved cautiously, weapons drawn. At the bottom, the air grew colder, more oppressive. The beam of Mara's flashlight swept across crude wooden beams supporting the ceiling, shelves lined with jars of murky liquid, and a table strewn with decaying papers. Against the far wall stood a cot, its filthy mattress stained dark. And then they saw them. Two small shapes on the floor, wrapped in burlap. Mara's heart pounded as she knelt and pulled back the covering from the first bundle. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a child, small bones bound with rope at the wrists and ankles. The second bundle contained an adult skeleton, a woman, her skull cracked as if struck violently. "DNA will confirm it," Mara whispered hoarsely, though she already knew. "It's them, the mother and son who had vanished 2 years ago." But as she rose to her feet, something else caught her eye, a map tacked to the wall. Dotted across the Adirondacks were tiny, red-inked XS, dozens of them. "Oh, God," one of the troopers muttered. This wasn't just one crime. This was a hunting ground. Before Mara could respond, Bo barked sharply, facing the staircase. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming down. "Lights out," Mara hissed. The troopers killed their flashlights. The cellar plunged into darkness. A figure descended slowly into the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying something metallic in one hand. Mara's heart thundered in her ears as she raised her weapon, finger tight on the trigger. The nightmare was not over. It was just beginning. The figure paused halfway down the stairs, the faint crunch of boots on old wood echoing through the cellar. Mara held her breath, her eyes straining against the darkness. A match flared. In the brief light, she caught a glimpse of the man's face, weathered, gaunt, eyes as cold as the wilderness outside. He lit an old kerosene lantern and set on a beam, bathing the cellar in a dim, flickering glow. "Always knew you'd find this place," he rasped, his voice deep and unhurried. "Been watching you crawl all over my land like ants." Mara's stomach dropped. "You're Earl Pritchard," he finished for her, smiling faintly. "Born here, same as my daddy. Same as his daddy. Folks like you think you own this forest. You don't. You just borrow it. And you always leave pieces of yourselves behind." Her finger tightened on the trigger, hands where I can see them. But Earl only laughed, low and unsettling. "There's no call for that, darling. You don't even know what you've stepped into." He raised the object in his hand. Not a weapon, a rusted bell. He rang it once. The sound was dull, metallic, but reverberated strangely through the rock, as if the earth itself responded. From somewhere deeper in the darkness beyond the cellar walls came movement. A shuffle, a groan. The troopers tensed, guns raised. "What the hell was that?" one whispered. Earl's grin widened. "You think I did this alone? You think this ends with me?" The wall behind him shuddered, and a panel of earth and wood swung open, revealing a tunnel. Figures emerged, hunched and filthy, their faces obscured by grime and hair. Men, women, some barely more than children. Dozens of them. Survivors? No, Mara's instinct screamed otherwise. Their eyes were empty, pupils blown wide, skin marked with strange symbols. "They've been here long before you," Earl said almost reverently. "We just keep the ritual alive." He dropped the lantern. Chaos erupted. Flames leapt as oil spilled across the floor. Gunfire cracked, deafening in the confined space. Mara dove aside as one of the creatures lunged at her, clawed hands grasping. She fired point blank, the recoil jarring her shoulder. "Out, now!" she shouted, dragging a trooper toward stairs. Earl vanished into the tunnel amidst the frenzy. The cellar shook as fire consumed it, smoke filling Mara's lungs. She stumbled up the steps, coughing, just as the floor gave way behind her. Outside, snow fell silently over the clearing, masking the heat of the inferno below. Mara collapsed in the snow, gasping, as flames roared from the ground. Tom Wilkins stood nearby, pale and trembling, Bo whining at his side. "Did you get him?" Mara stared at the burning earth. "No, and this isn't over." She looked back at the tree-line, dark, endless, watching. Somewhere out there, Earl Pritchard still moved in the shadows. And whatever lived beneath these woods, whatever had taken root generations ago, was far from finished. The Adirondacks would never give up their secrets willingly. And Mara knew she would be back.